Welcome to It's Interesting You Say That, a Bounce Back Generation podcast.
So I have a few stocks, not a lot. I'm not like a stock market person, but I was listening to CNBC this morning, and it's weird. People are like, I think, sort of freaking out, but they're trying not to freak out because the economy seems to be just in like this weird free fall. And then personally, as a nonprofit person, there's not a lot of money out there anymore. All of a sudden, it's like it's dried up. So I'm thinking about money a lot.
I feel personally it's felt like it's been here for quite a while. Especially, we drive around and we see the increased homelessness, we see increased crime in our neighbor. Like we're starting to feel the effects of a poor economy and people not having so many opportunities. And so to finally see it on the TV or say, this is not like I'm praying for a recession. I would not say that, but to see, okay, this is actually happening. This is actually happening. This is actually happening, instead of seeing it happening and being told like, no, we're okay.
Yeah.
Everything's good.
Yeah, and I think that we have been on that course for a long time. And, there were all these warning signs. I think maybe even like 10 years ago, be paying attention to the fact that the 1% owns so much and the middle class is just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And this whole thing that, you know, of course, when I was growing up, you did better than your parents. Your parents did better than their parents. I don't think I did better than my parents. I did maybe a little bit. I think, I'm not at the end of my career, but I'm heading towards 60. So it's like I'm starting to be able to assess and say, I don't know. I don't know that I'm going to do better. And I certainly don't see the path for my son to do better than me. And that is really, really, really bad. And I think that's what you've been talking about. And I think that's what a lot of MAGA people have been talking about. And we kind of like, oh no, the economy is great. It is, from a macro perspective. Like when Biden was in office, you could see that it was getting better from a macro perspective, but it wasn't hitting me. It wasn't hitting you. It was more like it was making it better for the rich people who already had money. They were like, oh yeah, this is a great economy because I can borrow more money because the interest rates are going down. What are we going to do?
I looking at I am definitely not doing better than my parents at this moment in time. And what's more, I don't want to say it's worrisome for me, but I think something that kind of clicked for me is that they grew up in a different time where there were different opportunities. And I'm growing up in a different time where there are different opportunities. So the things that they told me to do, or the path that they told me to take to be successful, or to be more successful than them, it doesn't exist. Um,
Hmm.
it doesn't exist. And even if it did exist, it wouldn't be as fruitful as when they did it, because when they did it, it was the ripe time to
Yeah.
do it. And so even if I did the same thing, so I go to college, I work a job, I put money in my 401k, maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but I would assume at the time that they did it, like when you invest in the market, like if you did it, the best time is like 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier. You get into Apple when it just starts, you're going to do much better than if you get into Apple right now.
Yeah.
But with that sort of mindset, I think, okay, well, that was their investment opportunity. That was their money opportunity. And so that's not exactly here right now. Or maybe it's there, it's just not going to give me the same returns. Where do I need to place my attention and focus so I can get in at, Apple on the first day? Not specifically Apple, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I asked, I've been doing this little series on bounce back generation about, because Gen Z is being fired all the time. Like there's this whole study that says that employers don't want to hire Gen Z because they find them that they're too sensitive. They don't have good, like life skills, like being on time and, follow through on work, and they don't communicate and they don't develop relationships at work, and all these kinds of things that I think are, anyway, I won't go through it because I already covered it in the videos I made. So I made one for Gen Z and I made one for their employers about how I see the fact that I don't think employers are recognizing, first of all, the trauma that Gen Z has gone through, from COVID to school shootings. I mean, all of this uncertainty in the economy, all of this stuff that's going on. But also that I think there's a there is a sensitivity there because the, who knows what's going on, and there isn't like this pathway that they can follow, like you were just talking about. And so I wanted to see like what are I asked, so this is not 100% accurate because of course it comes from AI, so take it for what it is. But I said, what are the top growth jobs for young people in the Bay Area? So we're talking about a tech area, right? And these are the top six: tech support and IT help desk. So I asked for, no, let me clarify this. I asked for top growth areas, top growth jobs in the Bay Area for young people that are just starting out, that don't have like a degree or anything, and that are kind of future proof, right? That as AI grows, this is what's going to be. So tech support and IT help desk, no degree is needed, and you can train for that. Electric vehicle maintenance and green jobs, because California has a lot of money flowing into the green energy sector. I don't know if that's going to last because the federal money is being pulled back. Construction and skilled trades, because you can join a union and become an apprentice. Healthcare support roles, so there's going to be a lot of older people. It's going to be not a lot of need for supporting them. So medical assistance, phlebotomy, where you take the blood. Warehouse and logistics, so Amazon, supply chain jobs, and then creative freelance work, so graphic design, social media, and content creation. Those are the top six jobs according to AI. And I find that terrible. They're just really low growth. Yeah, maybe you can move up if you do, electric vehicle maintenance. Where's the long-term growth in that, I don't know. I found that list really disheartening.
Well, I wanted to riff off of what you said about Gen Z being sensitive, and I actually watched the two videos that you made, and I thought they were really great. I thought they were interesting, and one of my thoughts was, because I've been kind of going through, maybe not this with work, but just with my parents or my in-laws, and just people who might come from a different perspective. Like I would say, like I'm much more sensitive than my parents, but not in the fact that I'm more sensitive. I think I'm much more willing to address what I'm sensitive about. I'm much more willing to address my emotions and what I actually think. And whereas they feel it and they might know it, but they're not willing to get into it. And I think that might be one of the major differences, because our generation definitely, mental health has been a huge thing. We have the internet, so not only are we like connected to the people around us, but we're connected to people across the globe. And so I feel like our empathy and our emotional awareness has almost been forced to expand just because of the influx of information, which is great. But then when I go talk to my parents and, they said something that was quite blunt or quite hurtful, but they don't realize it, and I realize it, but they don't want to address it, and you can't address it with them. You take that in, like, they're my family, so I love them. We're always going to work together. I will not set it down. But you go into work, you're not going to have that. If your boss says something, or somebody does something, or you feel a certain way, that is not, and maybe this is another thing. A professional environment isn't the environment for that. Like, you have to have your life and be managing your life so you get that fulfillment and you get to express yourself. But when you come to work, you work. And if you have differences with an employer or someone, like, that's business. And honestly, that's life. And I don't want to say, like, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but just acknowledging that there is that difference there, and you will have to overcome that challenge and find ways that you can cope with that so you can still navigate in the workplace.
So interesting that you would say that, because I'm kind of, even though I'm Gen Z, and Gen Z is notorious for, like, we ran around, nobody gave a damn about how we felt. I mean, it's like your parents are getting divorced and you're going from house to house and, I mean, everybody's got on drugs and all that stuff was going on. And we were like, okay, all right. Like nobody talked about our feelings. So I feel actually, and I think maybe this contributes to some Gen Z sensitivity. I think as a parent or as just an adult, there is much more of a sense of somebody should have given a damn about whether we were outside playing at 11 o'clock at night. There were commercials literally that would come on and say, do you know where your kids are? And we were told like the lights come on in the street and that's when we knew, oh, maybe we should go home. But even then I'd go home and nobody was like, oh, where were you? We were so worried about you. I remember running away from home at like, I don't know, 9 years old or something. For hours I was gone. I went to this like little tree fort and I sat up in the tree for hours and I thought, well, I've run away and that's it. And I went home and nobody noticed. So I do think that work is a place to have your emotions be respected at least, right?
Okay.
And what's the difference between having your emotions respected and having them just like splayed across the cubicles? Like, where's the line, right?
Well, this could be a harsh truth, could be a possible harsh truth for Gen Z that as emotionally intelligent as you may be and as much self-knowledge as you may have, you still have to respect where other people are at in their journeys and their emotional capacity.
Mm,
And so
yeah.
that means like your 70-year-old boss is not going to want to talk about their childhood trauma or care when your childhood trauma like comes into the workplace, no matter like how that's triggered. As long as it's
Mhm.
respectful, we're not breaking laws, we're not crossing boundaries. They're just not going to be willing to have that conversation. Or,
Yeah.
and I would say in general, most people aren't because it's a difficult thing to talk about. So if you come in and you want those emotions respected and you want people to know you and you want to be, your full version, a holistic self, no matter where you are, um, I mean, a
Hmm.
slow approach and address things from someone else's perspective so that you can actually form that connection and form that relationship to a point where you can talk about those things or you can have that freedom to be who you want, how you want. Um,
Hmm.
but in any you don't jump to marriage on the first date.
Right.
And so you don't jump into your job and say, I need this, and that's wrong, and this is wrong, and I'm not being respected, and this is how things should go. And also, but if you're silent about it and you just quit or you don't communicate, like you can't do that either.
Yes.
So that's a fine line.
So maybe what it is we have to talk about what is the appropriate way to bring yourself to work. I used to do this training where I to adults to people my age called bring your child to work day. That we bring our inner child to work, and so if somebody is disrespectful to us and that inner child is like, I was disrespected and now I have to go pout in a corner or I have to get revenge on that person. There is this kind of childish way of responding that I don't care what age you are. You see it all the time that people respond back to being disrespected or not having their feelings acknowledged. Or expecting their feelings to be acknowledged. That's the other thing. Like there's an expectation that you should already know that this is going to hurt me, you know. And I think that came out a lot with some of the wokeness, DEI thing, and all of that. Was that there was like, okay, we went through this training, so you should know that I'm being my sensitivities are being trampled on. And I don't think people understood that, and I still don't. Oh, hey, what are you doing? Sorry, this is my dog. What are you doing? He got his foot caught in the thing. Hey, right there, Prairie. Stop. Prairie, come over here. Prairie, here. No, walk this way. Good boy. Okay, now, hold on. Go back to your bed. Go to your bed. Good boy. He got his foot twisted in the power cord. He sleeps under in like the corner over there. So anyway, well, let me give you some examples. And then you tell me these are true stories of me being a Gen X boss with Gen Z workers. Um, so once I was doing a training with the staff and I showed a documentary called Happiness Happy. It's a really good documentary and it's about, kind of our perceptions and how we grow into happiness and what does it mean and things like that. And there's one, so it's a series of people telling their stories. And one of the stories is a woman talking about how she was in an accident and she became disfigured from the accident. But the accident then got kind of triggered these very deep memories of being sexually abused. And one of my employees left in the middle of the movie and then basically hid for like a day. And I had her supervisor find out like what happened. And she said, well, I've had that experience and you should have provided a trigger warning. And I said, I couldn't go through the whole movie and see if there was going to be something that was going to trigger somebody. I don't know what's going to trigger people. So what I had to do was do like a blanket trigger warning for every piece of media that I would put out there. It's like I just had the HR person put it into the handbook saying, you work in an organization that deals with trauma and, difficult emotions. So we are going to have media. We're going to, things are going to come up that might trigger you. Was that right or wrong? I don't know. Take this thing off.
I don't know. I tend to be. I don't think I'm like blunt to a point where it's negative, but I tend to be kind of harsh. And I think sometimes dealing with people, I think anyone, not just people my age or younger, but even people who are older, I do try, I don't say like, hey, trigger warning, I'm about to say something that might trigger you, but I think my general demeanor and the empathy at which I might try to address something difficult and just objectively say it helps people digest it better. And so if you feel like you're caught off guard, that can really hurt. It can make you uncomfortable. It can make you feel single. Like I'm sure that like no one knew until she walked out of the room. I'm sure. But
Mm-hmm.
then like that feeling inside her was probably like, oh, like a spotlight's been shown on me and maybe she hasn't even addressed what's going on with her. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that's necessarily fair for like you have to deal with that. It's just as much her responsibility. And where am I going with this? But I think I think it kind of involves like a kind of like you did like I can't trigger warn everything, but it's not like you're a unempathetic person either and you're not willing to make compromises and work with someone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where I have seen things go wrong in my own relationships, in professional relationships as well as personal relationships, is something like that happening, maybe not that exact thing, but something that just might be kind of awkward or somebody wasn't prepared or somebody didn't know how to communicate or we miscommunicated on both ends. And and then we don't want to deal with the stress of it, or we don't want to actually put in the work to think through how we could remedy this. And so the relationship just drop. All right, that's probably how just real romantic relationships drop too.
Yeah.
But if you can keep that up and you can just reach out and be like, oh, this is how, just say like, this is how that made me feel, or like, or whatever it is, and really try to work with that person. I think especially for Gen Z, there's a gold mine there because
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of people have those skills and are willing. A lot of those relationship and communication skills have been lost. Whereas I think maybe some of the older generations, since maybe they didn't address emotions and feelings in the same way, you just like you didn't have to deal with that stress. You just went
Yeah.
through it. Everybody's doing it. So I don't have to address this. We could just keep business, business, business.
Yeah, but there's such a dark side to not paying attention to people's emotions. So I think we've gone like one side to the other. We kind of always come back to this. I think that there's got to be this balance. So I worked for years as a lawyer, and in the legal profession, at least when I was in it, everybody drank like you would not believe. It was crazy how much drinking was going on. I'm not saying everybody, but there was just a certain contingent, and I would kind of dip in and out of it, where it was pretty much like after work, you would just like the job is so stressful that you would, after work, it would be part of the unwinding process. You got to drink and get it out of your system, and then you go home and, hopefully you get enough sleep and you wake up the next day and you go back at it. And I just remember feeling so burnt. Not just from the drinking, but just from the constant stress on my body. I always say that like being a lawyer was like 90% tedious work and 10% sheer terror that you were going to miss a deadline or you were going to mess somebody's case up so badly that they would never recover from it. Or so I think what you're talking about though is really interesting, that there is a pathway for Gen Z to use their sensitivity to create a new way of working that incorporates that sensitivity into other jobs. Because AI, the one thing that AI cannot do is authentically be a human being. They can mimic a human being and they can talk to you. And there's a new AI out that's this voice AI that is sounds extremely empathetic. I mean, they have programmed this woman's voice to be like, you listen to it and you just kind of melt and go like, she understands me better than anybody in the whole world, but it's fake, right?
That was something that was very present when I worked with Bounce Back Generation. Is and maybe one of the things I learned there is that well, our whole thing was kind of about drama or trauma and addressing it, and like you can't let your emotions like take the spotlight or take center stage in your decision making. And a lot of people that experience that trauma, and I think especially now when anything could be trauma, anything can be a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Not and look, I'm saying that with some sensitivity, but like not everything is world ending. Not everything is trauma, but I think in a weird way we've kind of almost like over glorified trauma. So now like real trauma and like something that should be a relatively normal thing to work through is now looked at as trauma. And so now you in your mind think, okay, like this is trauma. And so anytime I like come into contact with somebody who says anything about it or something that triggers that trauma or just that memory is now all like a huge thing when it really shouldn't be. But where I was going with that, if you let those emotions guide you, like you're gonna be reckless in the workplace. You're probably gonna be reckless in your life because you're letting those emotional decisions make decisions that probably should be co-created with your logic. But where am I going with this? So, but on the other end of that, the hero's journey, coming back to some of the things I learned at Bounce Back, like some of your weaknesses, some of the things that might hold you from that job, if you let your emotions run the show, like it's going to be not going to end well for you. But if you let that be a strength and say like, I have a lot of emotional intelligence, I have a lot of sympathy, I have a lot of empathy, or I have a lot of sensitivity, and I can use that. Not if I focus at 100% on myself, then everything's an attack, and everything is hard to deal with, everything is stressful, everything's trauma. But if I say like, wow, like let me try to give some of that empathy and sensitivity and understanding to someone else, and then you've completely turned how that mechanism works, and you've turned it in a way that works in your favor rather than working against you.
I think you've hit the nail on the head that you have to have had an opportunity to process where you are in your hero's journey. So, just to lay out the hero's journey, you have the origin story, which is your kind of original trauma. So, if you look at it like a superhero, then you have your secrets that you keep when you're young, and that could be secrets about like, your talents, or it could be secrets about bad things that happened. Then you need a mentor or a sidekick. Then you need to address your kryptonite, which is our bad habits, those things that take away your power. Then you need to understand what your superpower is. And oftentimes you can connect your superpower to that original trauma. So, like, my superpower is I want to help people to deal with trauma because I had trauma when I was growing up and I didn't know how to deal with it. And then I learned it, and now I think, a superpower to help people build resilience to it. And then once you've kind of honed that superpower and you learn it and you own it, then you turn around and you see who you can help. And that can be yourself, and it could be the world, it could be your family, it could be whatever. And that hero story, though, I think what happens is people take that raw origin story trauma, and then they take it to work, they take it to school, they bring it into their relationships, and they haven't gone through that process that says, how am I going to hone that? How am I going to turn that into something valuable? And I think that's what we're hitting up against, is that, we kids, yeah, someone who's Gen Z. I mean, honestly, when I was in my teens and 20s, I didn't even know I had trauma. I just knew that I was all over the map and didn't know and didn't understand myself and had anxiety attacks and was depressed and, turned to drugs or alcohol or whatever. And I think that's a lot to ask, but I think we have to, because it is so destructive if you don't address your trauma.
And on the opposite end of the hero's journey is the villain's journey. So you can take that same origin and you can go the hero's path, or you can become the villain. And maybe with a little bit more nuance, you don't become like the villain and you now perpetrate, or like whatever trauma you do, you pass it on to other people. It might not look that obvious, but like you keep yourself, you can be like your own villain. And so you hold yourself back. You shoot yourself in the foot. And like that doesn't get you anywhere.
Right. Well, the villain is, to me, I interpret the villain as somebody who had that original trauma, did not, like you said, go through and process it in a way that took that trauma and said, I'm going to F everybody, whoever tries to do that. I'm going to protect myself with these walls of defenses, which is what brings us, narcissism, for example. Narcissism is the building up of a wall that says, I need to be the center of attention because I have no depth of self. And so I need other people to tell me who I am. And then I'm going to manipulate people to do what I say and see me as, the biggest, most important person in the world. Because if I don't have that, I find that there's just emptiness inside. And that comes from neglect. I think I've talked about this before. If you read like Mary Trump's book about Donald Trump, who's like the most famous narcissist, but there's so many narcissists. But she talks about his really tragic childhood, and that, in the way he was raised, he had really no other choice to try to get love from his family and then from the world, except to become a narcissist, to try to make himself the center of attention, where people would see him and applaud him and serve him, and it's extremely sad. So how are we going to train or help people to process trauma so that they can, just function in life? And I'm going to ask you that question, and then I'm going to tell you a story about somebody who I saw was not able to fully process and what her life was like. I think she's a good example of that.
For me, at least, you run into a wall so many times. Well, I read this quote. I don't know where I read it. It might have been the Tao Te Ching, where it said like I might not have been though, but the quote was, the greatest cure for being sick is being sick of being sick. And if your trauma gets in your way so many times, eventually you'll get tired and just say like, I'm either going to fix this. It becomes a conscious choice. Like, okay, I need to process this because I'm just tired of all these effects. I'm tired of not having it processed. I'm tired of all these triggers coming up every day. Or you say like, you know what? I'm just going to deal with it. Like, I don't really want to do it. And I'll just see, what kind of happens if I don't do it. And maybe you kind of come to that conclusion again. You get that option again, or maybe whatever it is. But I think that's kind of, you get fired so many times that you're just like, you know what? I'm going to keep this job. Or I don't know, you end up, whatever it is. I think that's kind of the mechanism, or at least for me it is, or has been.
I think first though, I mean, let's take that like trauma is like the illness, right? And what are the symptoms of the illness? So talk about like, maybe examples you have where you can see that someone has unresolved trauma and they're taking it to work or to school or into their relationships. What would the symptoms look like of that?
The first symptom is if it has a negative effect on you. And I think when I'm talking to people, sometimes people will like brush over like really, really serious things. And so it might be the way that they dealt with a relationship or the way that they dealt with a work thing or like just how their self-talk is like really negative.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't they understand that. They're aware of it, but to them it's the norm and they've become accustomed to it. So as you experience it and as you continue to talk to yourself like that, as another relationship goes like that, as you enter another abusive situation or like you repeat the patterns, you're just so accustomed to it that like, yes, I know it's not right. No, it's not great, but you're just you're almost numb to it so that it doesn't trigger like a response of like, I need to think about this. I need to do something about this. This is like, it's more like, oh, like this is just how it went. And usually when I'll get on a call with someone and they'll say all this stuff, but they've gotten on the call because they know, maybe not specifically, but like this is not right and I need to do something about it, but I don't know where to start. Like I'm kind of sick. I don't really know where to start, and this kind of needs to be addressed from maybe a different perspective. So when I hear it and I hear like, oh, like you said what? This person did what to you? And because to me it's like, well, why are we doing that? And I think when you hear that from someone else, you're so accustomed to like you're numb, you're kind of numb to it, or you're kind of normal. You don't know what to do about it. You've kind of not given up, but you've kind of surrendered to how things normally go. And so to hear somebody say like, hey, like that's not right. That's not normal. That's not right. And things could be a lot better for you, I think. And then they hear that and they're like, okay, like tell me a little bit more. And I think that's kind of how you start. You have to like let somebody know in a gentle way, but in a very direct way, especially if they're coming to you or something like that, because then you have a little bit more leeway. You don't just go to a random person and say like that's not right. But they come to you and they're asking genuinely, and you tell them genuinely, hey, like I think this is the thing. And if they're open to it, you kind of take kind of like that first date thing. You don't jump straight to marriage. You just say like, let's just go on this one date. Let's just figure out this one thing. Let's just dive into this just a little bit deeper. And typically, like it doesn't have to be talking to someone. It can be like a video like this, or for me, it was like a lot of content where I could just take that one next step. Like I couldn't figure out the whole thing, but I could be like, okay, this is wrong. Do some searching on the internet and be like, okay, I think this is the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can just kind of keep pulling on that thread.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I would boil down what you said to you have a vision for how you so people who have trauma have a vision for how they dream their life can be, and they never can actually feel that it's possible to have it. So they grasp and try to make it real and so they get into they get into fights a lot, or they get taken advantage of, or they take advantage of other people, or they try to find shortcuts and things don't work, or I think it comes down to just a lot of things don't feel like they fit. And there's a reason for that because trauma actually changes our brain, especially in childhood. If you have a lot of, abuse or neglect, or, you live in stuff where you just don't know what's going to happen next, your brain just changes and it says, okay, you live in a world that is scary and threatening. So I better be looking out for you all the time because you're going to get hurt emotionally, physically, mentally. So the part of the brain that is looking for threats actually can become more sensitive. And so you can grow up. And I see this a lot with young people where you'll say something that is completely not meant to hurt their feelings, completely innocuous, and they will interpret it as an insult, or they will interpret it as something negative. And it's like a healthy person, a non-trauma, I don't want to say healthy because we're all healthy in our own ways. It is healthy for your brain to say, protect let's develop in a way to protect you. But a healthy or a positive outlook on life is a sign that you're not being afraid of threat all the time. And I think trauma makes you just extremely sensitive to, I'm going to get hurt. And then all the behaviors that come out of that are what show us a dysfunction.
Right, and that's why you need to, well, I think, and I think you would think as well, you need to process it, because if you
Hmm.
don't process it, you continue to have that sensitivity, which if it's great enough, like it's not going to allow you to do anything or to form any relationships. But once you process it and like you you choose consciously to go into that pain and process that pain, you become stronger in that process. And
Yes.
a lot of in the beginning of my relationship, well, honestly, a lot of relationships before my wife, but with my wife, because it's a bit more exaggerated, like she would say something, and I remember like I would feel like like a sense of like I wasn't masculine. Like she would say something that wasn't directed to me at all, and I would feel a sense of like, wow, like I'm not masculine enough, or like, wow, like she said that because she's seeing this in me, or she's saying that because of it when she wasn't. And then I'd start an argument because I would feel insecure. I would feel like I've been taken out of my perceived masculinity. I'm feeling threatened when really when I just dove down into it, it wasn't what she was saying. It had nothing to do with me, but I had my own perceived ideas of what masculinity should be. And because of my trauma, I felt like I always felt like my masculinity was threatened. And so for context, if you guys haven't watched the podcast, I went through sexual abuse as a kid. So as I grew up, like I was very sensitive in that way. I felt like I kind of had to overcompensate for my masculinity because of that. And so any little slight that I perceived from my wife, it was like it sent me into a whole like, oh wow, like I defensive. I wouldn't attack, but like I would get defensive. I'd start an argument, and then I realized like, wow, like if I just dive into this just a little bit more, and I can face that for myself, then when I have these conversations with my wife, we can just have a conversation. And I did, and now like she'll say something, and that trigger is still kind of there, like, oh, what does she mean me, or like what does she think of me? And but then I'm like, no, like I've already been through that. I already processed that. I already know what that is. And then we can kind of keep up the conversation. And that was a huge hurdle. But I could only imagine like you're in the workplace and that happens, and it's not your wife, it's not your friend. You can't really have a conversation with them like that. It's not the time to go process, and you just have to deal with that in the spot. Like that's difficult. So you have to like take that time to go deal with it so you can come back and you can get done what you need to get done.
Yeah. Yes. And it's like what you're explaining is like the trauma is like this veil or this filter that information from outside, whether it's something somebody did. I mean, I can think of times where I took offense to just the way somebody looked at me, and so we filter all the data that's coming at us gets filtered through that trauma lens, and then we're reacting, and then we have all these dysfunctional things happening because we're distorted. It's a distorted perspective. And the thing is that when you have addressed your trauma and then somebody does do something that's actually hurtful, meant to hurt you, meant to manipulate you, meant to do whatever, you have this capacity to kind of stand back and say, that doesn't affect me. You can say that, I'm dumb, or I'm ugly, or I'm not masculine, or I'm not feminine, or whatever, and it doesn't affect me because part of the trauma release is getting to know this deeper core of yourself. You're sweeping away that fear and the constant hypervigilance for who's going to hurt me next, and you're able to just develop the true you, and that's the superpower. Superpowers are, if you look at like superhero stories, superhero powers are about what's already inside you, and then when you hone those powers, you're just developing more of yourself. You're allowing it to come out. You know, you're not like, I'm getting power from outside and then jamming it in there. It's power that comes from inside, and I'm developing it. There was something else I was gonna say.
You said you had a story.
Yes, yes. So I knew this woman. So back in the day, as you know, Bounce Back Generation used to be Healthy Generations Project, and we worked in a community, a public housing development. And there was a woman who I love very much. She has now passed away, and she would tell her story. So I don't feel, and I think this would honor her process for me to tell her story. So when she grew up poor, in I think Mississippi, yeah, around Jackson, Mississippi. Watched her father pass away, and actually watched her father get shot in front of her when she was 10 years old. I think a lot of other stuff happened to her that, maybe I don't know, but I feel like there might have been other stuff happening around her sexually, when she was younger. And then she eventually made her way to Los Angeles, where she ended up in a very abusive relationship. And if you want to hear more about her story, actually, we have her husband, Eddie, told the story about her life from when he met her. And he started out with the story saying she was a very abused woman. She came to Los Angeles, ended up in a relationship where she was physically abused. She ended up using a lot of drugs. Eddie did too. They did drugs. They were homeless for a long period of time, and then they fell in love, and they had a child, and the child got taken away from them by Child Protective Services because I think because Brenda was on drugs and because they were homeless. I don't know that this happens a lot in the African American community, that people in poverty, but particularly African Americans, that the kids get taken away very easily. And I won't get, it's a whole other thing. And then they started to get their life together because they really wanted their baby back. And she had actually had children from another relationship, and they worked really hard. They got all the kids back. And then they moved to San Francisco. They got off of drugs. They found their housing and public housing, and they started to get involved in the community. That's how I met them, because they were very involved in the community. But when their daughters that they had together were in their teen years, they were track stars. They were incredible track stars. They were traveling all over the state. They were winning everything. And one day they were out at a track meet, and they got a phone call, and Brenda's son from her previous marriage was shot and murdered. So just tragedy after tragedy. And I could go on and on. I mean, the trauma and the tragedy that affected her and her family, if I told you the whole story, right now, the entire family has died. Eddie has died. The two daughters have died. It is beyond, like, you can't even wrap your head around it. Now, Brenda so she worked for us, and she would get triggered by so many things. Somebody would say something to her in a different tone than she understood, and she would get extremely angry. And there was yelling, and then sometimes we would sit and we would talk like we're talking now, and she would start to cry and not be able to stop crying. And that's why she wanted to work with us, because she understood how her trauma was so at the surface, and she worked hard to try to address it. She did see therapists. She worked with us. She did so many things in the community to help other people, but it was right there at the surface all the time. And the one thing that I think I can say is that she did do a process, so that her life was extremely meaningful despite all the trauma, because she faced up, she recognized what she had. So I think that's step number one. She knew that she had all of these traumas. She understood them. She named them, and she addressed them, and she became aware of them. She didn't walk around saying, I just have a jumbled up mess in me. The second thing she did is she knew what she was good at, and she loved children. She was very good with children. Children loved her. She was like the ultimate grandma, ultimate mother. She found her sidekick with Eddie. She and Eddie were just like this. And at some point, she and Eddie became involved in San Francisco politics. There are politicians to this day that owe their their seat to the work that Brenda and Eddie did, going around the city, getting the Black community to go out and vote. She addressed her kryptonite. She quit everything. She quit crack. She quit heroin. She quit every single thing that was bad for her, including salt, because she then had congestive heart failure and she couldn't eat salt. Can you imagine? Like, and she did it. And then she honed her superpower. She worked with us for years. There are children all over San Francisco who benefited from her love, her desire to give love to people. And it makes me emotional because she was a very beautiful person, despite everything she went through. And she turned around and she helped so many people. That's how you get through trauma. But it's a process, and she did it. It's very, very hard.
So it seems like maybe for the listener that there can be two conflicting ideas there. Like one, you deal with the trauma, but two, the trauma's still there. So where does it look like to, and I would say I definitely haven't been through that much, but I resonate with that to an extent. So what does that mean to you to have to kind of hold on to things, or like maybe the negative aspect of it is not held on to, but you still have that experience, but you're still working through it and you're still living the life that you want to live. So how did those two come together?
Well, I think the thing that I saw with Brenda was that it was part of her personhood. It wasn't like, I'm going to recognize my trauma and it's going to go away and I'm going to be Brenda who never had trauma before. That was never going to happen. So it became part of who she was. And so you could look at her and say, there's Brenda, this incredibly loving person. She was the kind of person that gave you a hug and you felt like the world was going to be okay. There was just so much love that came out of her. And that love was there because she had such deep empathy for pain. She understood pain at the very, very, very deepest level. That became who she was. That's how you turn trauma into a superpower. You don't say, I don't have it anymore. It went away. It became part of who I am, and I turned it into a strength.
So what would you say to people who are like scared of that? Like, so, you have trauma, you want to process it, but like you want to get rid of it. You want to leave it behind. You don't want it to be there. So how do you start knowing that?
Yeah. I think you have to assess how afraid you are. And if you're very afraid of it, you need help. You can't do it by yourself. Trauma, I think for most of us, we have to have somebody walk through it with us, even for a little bit. So, obviously you want to seek out a therapist if you feel like it's really, really intense for you. But you also want to find, like what you were saying, like do stuff where I always tell people, read a book about someone who's gone through what you've gone through. Watch a movie, start there and see how, and not because you're going to follow what they do, because there's plenty of movies and books where people just self-destruct from it. But that you first of all understand that you're not alone, that people go through horrors all the time. I actually just interviewed this woman who wrote a book called The Housekeeper's Secret for the Bounce Back Generation podcast. And I don't want to give away a secret, but they were a very wealthy family and they hired this housekeeper, and she went through kind of like Brenda level stuff, really bad stuff. And she came into their family, but she did not talk about her trauma. She would not, the whole family didn't know. And the woman I interviewed, who was the child in the family, who ended up writing the story of her housekeeper, said that, she wouldn't have been hired. We wouldn't have hired her if we knew what she had gone through, just because, at that time, this is like 60s, 70s, it's the horror of what she went through would have been like, oh my God, no, we'll never hire her. And thank God that they didn't know, because she ended up being this huge influence, positive influence on her and her family. So I think you have to start with the acknowledgement, and this housekeeper acknowledged it to herself but wouldn't acknowledge it to the world, and so I don't know. I don't think you have to tell the whole world that this terrible thing happened to me, but you have to tell it to yourself. I think you, to pretend like you can ignore it is really, I think, the most damaging thing. It is more damaging than saying I'm going to take the time and I'm going to do the self-love and care to get into it and see what it's doing to me.
So I guess maybe trying to come full circle. We started about the economy. We started about work, and we kind of then got into Gen Z and other generations, and then trauma in the work. So how do you how do you successfully integrate your traumatic experiences into who you are currently, so that you can be successful in the workplace or be successful in business, or despite whatever economic traumas you might have, going through this, what might or may not be a recession or just economic downturns, and still be, one, keep your sanity, but two, maybe like actually end up doing pretty well.
Well, how are you doing it? I'll tell you how I am, but you tell me first, because I think you're doing a pretty good job.
Trying, I guess, is simply trying not to think of it as like the world's out for me, or like there isn't a way. I always try to like take like reasonable accountability. I wouldn't say radical accountability, but like this isn't the economy's fault. This isn't, the person who I'm on a sales call's fault. This is this is my lack of sufficient market knowledge, or this is my lack of not being able to identify the key problem here. And I think once I look at it from that, then I stop the spiral. And then I'm like, okay, so like let me focus and then see what's the actual thing here that I need to do? What can I focus on? And if I don't have that, then I ask myself like, what have I been doing that has worked?
Mm-hmm.
And let me at least try to maintain that until I can figure out like the next thing to do.
I think the most beneficial thing that I've ever done in my life is I dropped the idea that I had to be, a millionaire by 30, kind of idea, which I did have. I had that kind of thought that by the time I'm 30, I'm going to be here, 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 and here. I'm going to do all these things. And there's just, I think a lot of Gen Z gets this already, that there's just more to life than being hyper successful. Now, do I want to have more money and more freedom and all of that? Yeah. But where I have money and freedom is just like in the way that I'm not afraid. That is the most important thing, is that I don't operate out of fear. If I hear the economy is tanking for whatever reason, I do steps to try to protect myself, but I don't operate out of this, let me doom scenario this all the way out. And I don't know how to explain the subtle difference between being prepared, like you're talking about, like how can I think my way through this, versus being terrified of what's going to happen. Because it is a very subtle difference and a very fine line. But I think it comes down to knowing yourself and knowing, you're going to get through things, and you're going to find a way. Just keep aware. Don't allow the bad voices in your head, which often come from the trauma, to be your guide. You've got to speak positively to yourself about what's happening, and you know, take it day by day. It all sounds so silly, but it's the the best thing in the world is to just be able to say, in this moment, am I okay? Yeah, the sun's shining, everything's good, birds are flying around outside. There's the Amazon guy delivering a package. I mean, how like everything's okay. And when it's not, I'll deal with it. And that's to me the most valuable thing. I have faith in myself that when things get tough, I'll be able to handle it.
The, if that fine line between thinking it through and then like doom scenario the whole way through, that's something I've done quite frequently. And one of the biggest things that's helped me with that is probably actually going through those doom scenarios just so like I get it out of my system. But kind of like the whole sick of being sick thing. I used to think my biggest fear was if I fail, whether that's due to the economy or my business, my own insufficiencies, like I'm a bad husband, I'm a bad father, my family's out on the, even though this is not exactly true, my family's out on the street, that I'm not a man. Basically, that's what it is. I'm not a man if I can't figure this out. But then that thought would trigger so many negative emotions that would overwhelm me, make me feel stressed, make me feel anxious to the point where it was consuming so much like physical energy, mental energy, emotional energy that I didn't even have. Like once I went through that whole loop, it could take a day, it could take two, like where I wouldn't work or I wouldn't work efficiently
Yeah.
or I'd be focused on the wrong things while I was at work. And so finally, like just cutting out that whole loop, it's like, okay, that thought pops up, that trigger pops up, but I've handled it, I've processed it, I went through it. Okay, what's the next thing? And then so like over the course of like a week, I don't know how much time you save over the course of a month, but kind of like you said, it's not like it's step after step. And I think a lot of people try to like start a chess game and I don't know, chess, checkers, whatever it is, but like you try to checkmate on the first move when you just need to make the first move to see
Yeah.
what your opponent does.
Yeah. Yeah, and I had this image while you were explaining that think of it like you have some gears. Like it's not that complicated. You get afraid, you trigger your nervous system to go all crazy and fight or flight and oh my God, I can't think. And then you go through to that's your emotions. So you think of it like your brain is like three layers. So you got the reptile, that's fear, oh my God. And then you have the middle part of your brain, and this is very simplified, but then the middle part of your brain is like emotions and memory. Oh, this is like that time that it happened, and I'm gonna be so embarrassed and everybody's gonna make fun of me, and it's like, oh, I'm not as great as I thought I was, and they're all gonna stand and point their finger and laugh at me. And then you move along, like keep going in the gears, and then get to right here where you say, "Oh, look at that! My body's freaking out. My brain is trying to bring up all these memories of bad things that happened, and I'm gonna just let those go. I get where they come from, and I'm afraid. And what do I do when I'm afraid? I think about a way to get out of this." And I think about the right thing to do at this moment, and I quiet those voices because they're over amplified in my brain, and I'm going to think of something and I'm going to go on the next step. I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's kind of like how I look at it.
Well, I'm definitely not a science person, but may, maybe you could answer this for me. If you start from the reptilian brain, fear, just instinct, survival, and then you graduate, something kind of graduates to the emotional, so you're processing it through there. But like if you don't get through the emotional to the next part, and then all this trigger gets figured, does that like re-incite the reptilian brain to create more
Yeah.
fear?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, you can get stuck in that loop and oh my God, I remember that time. And then it's like, no, now my whole body is like, freaking out, my heart's pounding or I feel sick to my stomach and all that because what's happening is you're trying to go into fight or flight. This is why it's so important. This is why the book that Bessel van der Kolk wrote about the body keeps the score is so important. Your body will contain all that stress and it'll keep you on a loop freaking out because then you'll be like, I feel okay, and then all of a sudden, why is my heart pounding? Why do I feel so weird and out of it? Well, because you're in fight or flight and you haven't done anything. You've sat in your desk in front of your computer or you're sitting on your phone and you're stuck in that loop. Go outside, get a walk in, shake it all out, go dance, go scream, and then come back. And then your emotions will come up and allow them to come up and face them. Don't let them trigger you. If they trigger you back in a fight, then you got to go take a walk again. So we're connected in that way. And the model that I'm using is this very simplified neuroscience model that says that your reptilian brain developed first. So that's the first part. And from an evolutionary perspective. And then we grew this limbic system brain, which is your emotions and memories. And you did that so that you could go, oh, that time that I walked by that cave, there was a tiger there. And I remember I got really scared and it made me feel so vulnerable. Now, because that helped you protect you. So the next time you didn't just go into fight or flight, you remembered that made me go into fight or flight. So don't go there. And then we developed, the last part of our evolutionary development was the executive functioning. I'm going to plan how not only I'm not going to walk by that cave, but I'm going to set a trap for the next time that tiger comes out so I could trap it and get it out of my life, right? So you have that capacity to do that. And that's what to me, that is how I process those things that come up.
So what's the trick to get from that limbic to or from the emotional to the executive functioning? Is it like, I'm not sure if there's no shortcuts, I'm sure, but is there a scientific method to get there, or is there a personal method that you use to get out of that?
So I think there's probably a lot of methods. The one that I promote is first breathe, because it helps to control your, kind of reptilian fight or flight response. You start calming your nervous system. Then the next thing is you're going to, what was my breathe? Oh my God, now I can't remember them. I just did a whole video on them. Um, oh,
But it,
okay. First you breathe, get your control of your nervous system, then move your body, right? So you get out and you're gonna run around or do whatever you need to do to get that out of your body because your body wants to go into fight or flight. And then you need to then you're going to be in your emotional brain too. So that's where you want to get this part online to start talking to yourself. So you're going to be like, so the emotional part of your brain is going to send you feelings or words or, memories. And you're going to be like, oh my God, I'm being attacked. And all you have to do is start to get that part going where you say, okay, this is where all those feelings are coming up. I was so embarrassed that time. And oh, that felt so terrible. And oh, that was painful and difficult. And then you're just noticing, which brings me to so you're going to talk kindly to yourself, recognize and say, okay, you got this. It's going to be all right. Let's start to calm that down. Send some love to yourself. And then the fourth thing is so important. Then get into a meditative practice, because the meditative practice allows you to rise above all of those things and see those processes happening. Once you get into that, then you can sit there and say, okay, I can feel this all happening right now. I'm going to stop. I'm going to get into a mindfulness meditative state. I'm going to notice, oh, look, there's those words coming up again. There's that feeling coming up again. I'm going to release it. That's what meditation allows you to do. Recognize, see the process, release it. And that gets you to this part of yourself that is beyond trauma, beyond your feelings, beyond your nervous system, and into this person, this self that is perfect and okay and always all right. That will go on an infinity and be okay.
okay, and so that's where now you're in the state where the whole neuroplasticity rewiring your brain comes in, where you're in that state, and from there you can think and act in a way that you want to think and act in, rather than out of the fear. And then you start like practicing that instead of practicing what you usually do.
Well, then you can make choices. So one of the things that I noticed early on with meditation was that I would have a lot of ideas come up. I meditate where there's like a ton of stuff, and oh, I'm thinking about tomorrow and yesterday and da da da. And it takes a while to kind of slow it down. And then I would have something come up like, oh God, that person gets on my nerves, and I could consciously say, I recognize that that's happening. That's probably something from my past or whatever I'm thinking. I'm going to let it go. And then you're choosing, then you're not in reaction. You're not like, now I went out, tomorrow, and I saw that person and I went off on them. Now you are making conscious choices about what you want to do, who you want to be. And so I literally say, it's like, it comes up and you're like, no, I don't want to do that. And then another thought comes up, no, I don't want to do that. Another thought comes up and it's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Would that be supportive of who I want to be? And then you make these choices that are clearer choices than just jumbled up mess, trigger, and then regret, or consequence, right? Which is how we live when we're traumatized.
That feels like getting your head above the clouds. Mm-hmm. Or at least you saying that, that's what I'm picturing. It's like, it's a breath of fresh air. It's clarity. It's consciousness.
Yes.
Rather than just going back in the same loop.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, but it takes work, and I don't always do it, and I should. And then what'll happen is I'll realize I'm a jumbled up mess, and then time to start getting back into my practices. And it's all those things: breathe, move, talk kindly to yourself to break that pattern of negativity. Mindfulness, meditation. Take the time to slow down. Slow those thoughts down, get a sense of all of who you are, and then you can act. That's what works for me. I'm not saying, I'm not prescribing, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist or anything. It's what works for me.
No, the way you broke it down, I think in such an accessible way, but then also the science behind it. For me at least, like, it's a huge reminder. Like, I do that, I tend to do it only when I need it, and I don't always consciously think about it. But I think if it's something that I did more often, just as like a maintenance thing, I don't know. I think that's really helpful, just the way that you phrased it.
Yeah, well, I hope it's helpful for people. And I feel like after this call, I'm going to go meditate for 15 minutes.
That was my first thought too.
I need to chill out for 15 minutes or so.
Thanks for listening. We hope you'll subscribe for weekly podcasts about building personal strength, mental resilience, and emotional balance. You can also find free tools, resources, and quizzes at bbgtv.org. That's bbgtv.org.